let's start by defining the term sick. What kind of problems might this be? What were you investigating in your report and in your book?
The question, can your music make you sick, was a question that I had from an essay I was writing in 2014-15, before I even met George, actually, where I was trying to conceptualize the experience of artists trying to get their music heard. And also, actually, that essay was called There's a State of Emergency, the production of music is out of control. And for me, I was trying to deal with that in my own life as a music manager, as an educator, as somebody that works at a record label. There was just so much music, and I felt that music was making me sick. Personally, I felt like the anxiety about, as a music manager, the foremost thing I would wish for an artist is that their music manager, the person that is responsible for their artistic career, cares about them and their music in a very real sense, right? And I feel that as a primary responsibility of managers. And when you are working in an atmosphere of overproduction, and I understand that in cultural industries and in media industries, it's very difficult for people to even conceptualize the idea that it's overproduction. But for me, it wasn't difficult at all. It was simply like, I have 24 hours in a day, I have a certain amount of time to listen to music, and this is too much, stop, So I was like, nobody ever asked that question, can music make you sick? People always say music's wonderful, music's universal, music's the best thing in my life. And I was like, hang on a minute, let's get real here. Let's deconstruct our relationship to music. And so for me, that was a kind of question. The sickness that I mean in that sense is in an entire sickness, like what kind of society allows music to be abused in such a way? What kind of society lets its babies die immediately? What does this mean? So for me, it was like a very big, using the term sickness in its biggest sense, in its widest possible sense, from being physically unwell, from being contagious. That's another thing. I think music is a very contagious art form. We rely on it being contagious, yeah? So if it's contagious, it very much suits the viral environment, the digital environment, where we talk about it as viral. Post-pandemic, I was like, are we going to stop using virus as a way to describe the? We've got a different relationship with the idea of viral now, right? But the internet very much embraced this idea, and my feeling, I started working in the music industry. I started, wanting at one point to be in a band. All my boyfriends were in a band. All my friends were in a band. They were artists in the 1970s. So for me, it wasn't just a thing I did or liked. It was utterly a way of life, and it was a way of life for everybody that was in it. So I came into the digital world not as a digital native, as a refusenik, I was like, get away with this, all this stuff. So I've always been skeptical about the idea that all progress is good, right? That kind of scientific belief. I mean, we should at this point be very skeptical about science, full stop. So I think it was profound. It was a profound sick, I mean sick in its most widely used way.
Why do you think it took you, I mean, not only you personally, but also the whole industry, it took so much time to open this conversation? Actually, wouldn't music make people sick in the 70s as well, or in the 80s? So why are we talking about this now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the 70s and 80s, and in any period of time, there has been a potential for all art forms to have a negative impact on those producers, because if we take art back in its anthropological place to something that is linked to expressions of spirituality or understanding, right? So if that's where you're dwelling, if that's where your head's at, that's what you're trying to do, it's involved with magic, it's involved in medicine. So for me, that link is always there. Why did the industry, right? I always say, well, which industry? Who are these people that are the industry, right? I think that's a genuine concern that we have this way. Oh, the music industry. I've never been to that place, right? I never got on a bus that said the music industry and get off the bus at the music industry, right? It's a complex web of competing interests. Why doesn't it talk about it? Why do these different sectors talk about it in different ways? Is related to the positions they hold in terms of what they're doing. So, record companies, major record companies, don't talk about the impact of hyper competition on artists, because artists are fundamentally what they use to get there, right? So their relationship to exploitation is very different to that of the exploited. A slave has a very different view of a plantation than a plantation owner.
Yeah, that's true. For your report and for the book, you've interviewed several thousands of musicians, right? And
we surveyed 2,000 musicians.
2,000,
yeah.
And most of them admitted to have some sort of health issues. Depression, 68%, which is like a huge amount, and anxiety and panic attacks, even more, 71%. Did you ask them if they reported it to someone before you asked them about it actually? Did they seek any help?
It was one of the questions, if they had sought medical help, and they had sought by and large. But we also, later on, more recently, have had our research tested by scientists, by neuroscientists. And science is an interesting place to look at hierarchies of knowledge. So you do a survey as a social scientist and people go, oh, it's a survey. The scientist does it, go, wow, look at that, it's knowledge, right? So we've had our findings ratified by scientists as being real problem, and they had a scientific way of doing it. But I think that has been an interesting point that has been raised many times, is like, oh, these people said they were sick. And I was like, well, yeah, who goes to the doctor without thinking they're sick? You don't go to the doctor on a good day and go, I'm fine today, but do you think I might be sick? No, you go there because you're feeling sick, right? So we are always self-diagnosing. And if someone says they're depressed, well, we're going to say, oh, you're not. Like, what kind of human would say that? Maybe my mother. But no, yeah.
And who were the subject of your research? I mean, there is like a whole different experience of being a professional musician in symphony orchestra, and totally different experience of being like a struggling singer-songwriter in your early 20s.
Well, we would think that. That's what we would think. But our research showed us that actually their experiences were very similar. Although their experiences of life might not be similar, in that, we found our research, we looked at for classical musicians, rock musicians, reggae, drum and bass, across the electronic field, and also to the singer-songwriters. But one of the things we did with all of our research is that everybody was a professional musician. So we didn't look at anybody that was a DIY self-releasing artist. So we had defined professional musicians according to whether they had to be signed to record labels, and What was very
Music is like the main source of the income.
yes,
Yeah?
absolutely, yeah. So what was interesting about members of orchestras, because I don't know a lot about classical music or their habits, so it was very interesting to me. I interviewed also opera singers, was the incredible pressure they were under to perform every night. They would perform 6 weeks in a row, traveling, and their contracts were incredibly restrictive, their hours of work, and they have to perform. They can't go having a bad day in the middle of the orchestra. So the pressure that they felt to be on top of their abilities at all times, every day, was obviously causing them a lot of stress. And then when you spoke to musicians that had just been signed to a record label and they want to make their best song, you heard them talking in very similar ways about the pressure to deliver or to be really good and to be in a good mood. And they all talked about the requirement of the job they did to be feeling up and feeling positive. Which is a very strange place to be. You wouldn't imagine someone in a bank is like, oh, Monday, can you please be very positive about banking? No one's going to be in that position, right? But for musicians, it has become part of what they do is to present themselves in this very positive light.
My guess would be that professional musicians, like orchestra musicians, are trained to meet this and to somehow manage this pressure, because those who don't, they actually don't even make it through the music schools. While the amateurs who become professionals.
Yeah, but that what you've just said really echoes with the last panel I did on gender diversity, because in music schools there's a lot of it's exactly the same, the amount of women and men, and then when you go to orchestras it's not at all the same, right? So something else is going on there that I would say was systemic and different. But practice is a very central part of all music experiences. Whether you're a DJ making loops, you're playing it again and again. What's very interesting to me, something that we write about in the book, is that the practice of digital life is also very repetitive. You turn on your phone, you check your emails, you're like doing this with your thumb. So music practice and music normative behaviors link up very easily with the digital world and into social media. That was something that I was particularly interested in, looking at how this transition was impacting. For classical musicians, their relationship to social media also existed, but often in a very different way. But whether they're more resilient, it wasn't my experience of them as being more resilient. I think that would be a different study for us to say, let's take what goes on in an orchestra versus what goes on in a rock band versus what goes on in the electronic field and see who performs better. I mean, on a kind of, we might say, well, let's hope they're not taking so many drugs in the orchestra, or they're not so drunk, or, I don't know. But I think maybe we would find the habits around their environment, their working environment might be different, and that might have an impact on how they feel about their work. But those that we interviewed felt that they were under a lot of pressure.
The subtitle of your book is Measuring the Price of Musical Ambition, and I think this this might be a part of the problem, the ambition thing, because you've mentioned the job in the bank. I assume someone who's going to the interview to get the job in the bank has his view of the work he's going to do is pretty much, his expectations are pretty much like it's really going to be. While someone who's trying to make it in the music industry has this view of what's going to happen or what he's trying to achieve based upon this not very true picture of successful musicians, someone to
Well, a myth of what?
Yeah,
a myth, yeah, a fairy tale, the believing in, yes.
Yeah, so the gap between the myth and the reality might be like bigger than in other professions.
Absolutely, but I think that your point about the classical musician, because that made me think of a question that I've never thought about before, but if you're the lead violinist in an orchestra, is that the height of your ambition? Does a lead violinist secretly want to be the composer? There's a very different set of ambitions and beliefs that are going on in different genres and within different areas of music. And all of those, so maybe one could say that the hierarchical structure of classical music is so well known that it's easier, one might argue this, it's easier for those with classical ambition to understand where they might end up. Whereas for a young singer, it's like, I might be Ed Sheeran, or I could be Dua Lipa, or, the difference between there is quite often like saying, I'll actually invent a cure for cancer. They're so large, the difference is so large. But the steps of musical ambition, the stages of musical ambition are often quite similar across genres in terms of this learning what you do, what amount of time you spend doing it, how much of every day you're doing it, where that takes you away from other parts of your life. It was very interesting. All the musicians we spoke to talked about time as an expense. It wasn't something they lived through. It was something they were spending. Time spent doing this. It was a real quantifying pressure for them. I've been doing this for this amount of time. I've done this, and nothing being there. Like at the end of 5 years, I didn't get that. And then if you said, well, what did you expect to get at the end of 5 years? And they all have some kind of expectation, or that within the mythologizing and within their own conception of what they're doing, they always anyway move that boundary because they want to keep doing it. In the way that we made a comparison with betting or addiction. If you're an addict, you'll always move the boundaries. If you're a gambling addict, you're like, the next time, Musicians were very fond of keeping the next time in view.
Talking about time, time is also the factor that is crucial when it comes to valuing your work, and like society doesn't take into account the amount of time that is required to practice, to compose the work, to prepare the half an hour long music program that you present on stage. And then you can hear the questions. How happened that you ask such amount of money for just half an hour of work, while people get this for a week of work? So it's also...
Yeah, time is very distorted. An interesting thing about music is that it happens in time. A song starts and it finishes. It's run through. It has rhythms. So it's a time-based medium, but within the experience of living, what we call the people that work in music, myself included, I call myself a music subject. I am subjected to the world of music, and there's that sets of beliefs and norm, and so it impacts me as much. I never feel I'm outside of it. I'm always very much in it. And nobody, if you got paid per minute, what would that mean? I'm always saying that to people. What is the unit value of music? It's a question I ask my students. How would you quantify the value of music? One of the things we can all agree on is that music can't be quantified economically because it has interior and it has psychosocial dimensions that are good for society as they are for ourselves. And then, so part of it exists out of an economic dimension. And then what kind of world values music? What kind of world would we be living in if we understand a value outside of an economic value or beyond it?
And there is a trap about value in music described by Dr. David Graeber, the anthropologist, yeah. And he noted that society values the work of musicians or artists, actually, in a very unjust way, because if you enjoy what you're doing, if you like your job, you should be paid less than if you hate it.
Yes, but that's not true. That's also not true of care workers or garbage men, right? Yeah. When people say that to me, I'm like, you want to look after some old people, or you want to go pick up the garbage, right? So it's really easy to make. I love David Graeber, but it's easy to see how jobs that we love doing and our relationship with music is a relationship. It's not a thing, you know. It's not the same as, oh, I like the color red. It's not the same, right? And because it's all encompassing, because we're entangled in that idea, because our identity is wrapped up in it, we stop making or demands, or we organizing ourselves, or understanding the infrastructures, or we ignore. We voluntarily do that, as well as being uneducated. Often we just like, you know, one of my sons who's a musician had some mail at my house, and I'm like, Adam, you know, you don't open your mails at my house. And he said, I'm a musician, I don't open the mail. I was like, oh, right, okay. That's a bit bad mother. But yeah, you know, just can't look at the reality. You can't have people waving that stuff in your face very often.
Has the technology changed the valuation of music and the work of musicians as well? Because, for example, you can now like have a party without asking a band to play, because you can dance to the record or to the songs to the playlist you find on the streaming service. You don't have to pay a composer anymore to have some music for your ad, because you can download it from like a free stock. So is it also a factor of anxiety for musicians?
Technology everything changes, and technology has changed everything, right? Anyway, and I can't stop that. Yeah, we can't stop that. Yeah, all of those things are massively impactful. But one of the things that digital technology, social media, all of these things, user-generated content, what it's really done, it has really amplified the amount of people making creative works, right? And it has muddled what we understand as labor in any traditional way, which muddles then and confuses and complexifies the ways in which we identify with who we are. If what we do is a central driver for most people, what do you do, right? What do you do? Like, that's a question we will ask now. That centrally is destabilizing, but also it's so much in the ether that people always say that thing to me, oh, were they a professional musician? And I said, well, they said so. Like, I didn't actually ask them for that. Rather than ask the doctor if they felt depressed, I should have said, can you give me your bank account? Right? Because they all said they were professional. They all said they earned money, but actually I didn't look into that, which would have been a much more, possibly, something that we wouldn't want to do, but maybe a more realistic way of understanding what does it mean to make music now. There have never been so many musicians. Or,
And also the big change in making music, for example, comparing the end of 20th century and like the years before pandemic is the big growth of live music sector. With this in mind, do you think that also has changed an impact of the health of the musicians? For example, I don't know, is it more exhausting or I mean, before the pandemic, I will ask the pandemic as well. So.
Live music became a place where musicians could get paid. I always say some musicians, because the reality for lots of musicians was they were touring and not really getting paid, and it was costing them a lot of money. So the live music industry has always been much more complex, and was much more complex before the pandemic than anyone admitted to. What the pandemic did was go, ha ha, now, look at it now. And then there was no way to say, oh, this or that. So it was very interesting in that sense. But live music, touring, living in that way, in a very difficult to sustain way, impacts the health of musicians and everybody that works in music, and everyone, venue owners, cities that rely on venues. All of these things are massive. Live music is massively connected to environments and to people that go and can't go, and so. It's all changed. It's all changing. It doesn't. There's loads of things that I love about touring. And there's lots of things that I didn't like about touring. Particularly not getting paid. Turning up at a terrible venue with a band and getting paid nothing, and driving home in the night thinking, why are you going to do this tomorrow? You're going to drive to some ridiculous place and get paid nothing, and and all of that. And then at the same time, I've been able to walk out on big stages at big festivals, and those moments, it was like nothing can beat this. This is the best, right? And there you are, hooked back into it. Playing music live and being at a live event, no matter what the technology is out there, for me, for my generation, because I think that we are seeing a new aesthetic of relationships to music. Our relationship to music is changing, and younger generations have a completely different relationship. I think the visceral response for me, I saw Patti Smith live at the Roundhouse supporting the Stranglers in 1976, I think it was. It was her first live gig in London, and I left that building a changed person. I was utterly changed. I went home and I was like, I have been reborn. Nothing will, I will be Patti Smith. I will. Everything about that moment changed my life. That's my generation. That was the thing for me. I never saw a thing. I was going to see a woman on stage screaming at everyone. It was just like, whoa, this is the best, life can be. So it's very hard to know that. It's very hard to know what live music will be in the future. But without our venues, we have, I don't know what's happening in Poland, but in the UK, the problem caused by the closure of venues and all the people that work in venues and everything,
some of them
cities,
and
absolutely, I mean, it's really devastating. So, I mean, we have to have an intervention. We have to have a government intervention to prevent that.
Before we talk more about the live music, you were talking about generations. Did you take that into account while doing your research, like demographic factors? And is there any pattern in there, like age, gender?
Well, we did. We took into age, gender, social, economic background. We distorted our research by researching 50% non-males, so that we made sure that we captured the voices of women and non-binary people at a greater ratio than you would see them in the industry. And of course, but it was not surprising to me that some of the things that the women talked about, parenting, age, body issues, anorexia, sexual assault, I mean, it was very depressing what they talked about, but it wasn't surprising. But women talked about age in the second sentence, it's the first thing, I'm getting old. you know, and it's like we're all getting old. And that was that thing. And that's not to say that males did not talk about aging, because they did, and they did talk about body image, but not first. It was, you know, I think what's interesting when George and I started to analyze the way in which people spoke was very different. So it was very different. And how women talked very quickly about not looking at other people's social media. Right? Because that was like, oh, they look amazing. They've got, you know. And it was very interesting how competition for those women seemed to be, because those were also their friends. So the people they're talking about, their friends, are also their competition. And that was, maybe it's because in a very gendered way, women are in tune with that idea of friendship. That was distorted. They found that more difficult, whereas the guys would talk about other people making a really good record. You know, instead of talking about their own emotions, about how they felt about it, they were like, oh, my friend made a really good record. Or so it's interesting how the different patterns of the way in which we talk about our emotional worlds, you know, and emotional distress, you know.
Yeah, and the pandemic, by taking away the concerts, the pandemic demonstrated how the music industry is actually economically inefficient, because, of course, lots of other industries were hurt as well. But I don't think that they were hurt in such extent. And I don't think that I've heard the voices, maybe this is because of the bubble I live in, but I don't think I've heard the voices very common within the music industry or directed towards artists. Why don't you change a job? It's like, you know, the best kind of advice when the pandemic started is don't complain that there are no shows, just change a job, do something, you know, get a proper job.
You didn't hear that?
I did hear that.
Oh yeah, we had a minister, we had a government minister suggesting that. That didn't go down so well, I have to say, fortunately. Are you asking me if that's good advice? I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the question is.
No, I'm not asking you if that's
good
advice, but the question is actually if that also happened in the UK, because...
Well, yeah, of course it happened in the UK. We have a really unsympathetic government to the arts, you know, they said all kinds of stupid things. You know, they're moronic, basically, but... yeah, I mean, it's a non-question, isn't it? Get another job. For me, it's a non-question. I tried being a lawyer once. It was horrible. I left I faxed. This is how long ago it was. But I was at the Miami Winter Dance Music Conference giving a talk on copyright, and I went back to my hotel and faxed my resignation to the law firm and told them to send my stuff home, and I never went back. I went to see Fatboy Slim that night. Felt a lot better. Yeah, I don't know. I think that music subjects are reluctant to give up their country and their life.
Maybe let's focus a little more about the subject of ambition and expectations. Maybe the push for success and in the artistic professions is kind of understandable and even applauded. Maybe this push kind of hurts us, hurts musicians. So maybe there is like...
the push to ambition hurts.
Yeah, the push to success, you know. Because it's actually what's awarded, you know, not that record is good, but if it sells good, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very strange atmosphere to work in, because you can have a record that is recognized as incredible, and yet it has very little economic value. And then, you know, it's always good to look at history, and people like Nick Drake would be a really good example of someone that made a record that no one cared about when he made it, but where would we be without Nick Drake now, or John Martin, or... I mean, there's lots of people that get discovered after their time, in a way, and records that get discovered. And as a music manager, I've worked with a lot of artists that haven't had top 20 success, or top 100 success in a way, also very much from the DIY scene. But you need to support your artists so that they can realize their ambition or produce the music that they wish to produce. And yeah, it's very difficult. The value of music I was referring to before is also that value. Is it good? Is my record good? It's only good if people buy it, or, you know, it's very difficult when you work in a very subjective world. Just again, talking about the last panel I was on, you know, this idea that if you book bands with women in, people won't show up to see them because they're not as good. I'm like, oh, come on. You know, it's very subjective, and we know that, who the cultural gatekeepers are, what makes a record, you know, what we like about it, or we find to be good, or how new records, new musicians. You know, I'm very concerned about new musicians, young musicians, and you know, I found it very difficult in the pandemic to listen to new music, and I was aware of that I was going to listen to old records for comfort, but then recently, coming out of the pandemic, I've been listening to loads of new music and really getting excited, but I had to get to the mental state that I could do that, right? And I'm not even a musician in that sense, you know, but I'm very aware of that, and it's difficult. You know, that I always say to people, it's very difficult to be a musician and put yourself on the line, and that's very common in the creative arts. You know, when you put yourself out there in that way, you put yourself in a vulnerable position, and it's no surprise to me that many artists are very vulnerable people, lots of levels. It's just a hard thing to do.
But also you've got like some additional reward that like outstanding bank employee cannot count on, because he won't get a standing ovation for doing his job properly. No one will tell him that he changed someone's life, or you know. No one will tell him that he loves him, and this is also some sort of reward, very important, I guess. So this could have a rather healing effect on musicians than the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, all the musicians that we interviewed, if they ever had those experiences, and several of them did, and you hear that anyway when you hear musicians. They always say, you know, someone randomly bumps into them or tells them that that song's at their wedding, or they love that. Why wouldn't you love that? That's lovely, you know. So, yeah, people love that. That is very healing. It doesn't necessarily happen all the time, but yeah, sure. I mean, I think what's really interesting is that none of the musicians that we interviewed ever said they went into making music for money. None of them said that. Not one of them said that. So that disconnect between what you might actually get at the end of the day and why you do it is very much part of the world of being a musician. And that connects with all the other people that work in the world of being musicians, because you do need to have money, you know, because we live in a monetary system, and you need to... And so, you know, you meet an A&R person and they say they're only in it for the money. No artists, I'm sorry, that doesn't go down well with artists, but you meet people like that. I think you wouldn't meet them now. They're much more, people have changed the way they speak, you know, in record companies because artists don't want to hear that, you know. Or they want you to be in it for the music, or, you know, and again, different genres have different sensitivities to economic outcomes, you know. So I think it's not all the same. It's more complicated than the myths make it seem.
And also, I've noticed that, like in the pandemic, most of the musicians I know, they were not complaining. Of course, they did as well about the lack of income, But what was even more stressful for them, it was the lack of contact with the audience. It was something else was taken away from them than just the source of income.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we saw, certainly in the UK, we saw different artists responding differently to that problem, the lack of contact, and we saw what some people are now calling this new intimacy, a new sense of intimacy that's created through the screen, mediated through screens, not being in the present. So some people that worked better for, and not so well for other people. But I think, again, it goes back to this thing that music is a relationship. It's not something you do down a hole on your own forever. I mean, of course, there will be some musicians that do that, but it's not really. It's a system of communication. You want to communicate something, and if you want to just go outside and shout your message up to the sky, and you don't care if no one hears it, great. Most musicians want their message to be heard, and they want to see a reaction.
I have to ask this question. Do people really get sick from music, or does music attract the sick? I mean, does it attract people who are hypersensitive, fragile, more vulnerable, easy to break?
Difficult to measure. Very difficult to measure, and I know some very physically and mentally well musicians. I also know some musicians that would describe themselves even as not so well, and I often think that people that have experience of differing mental states or emotional distress or experience trauma may be able to give us insights into the world. I think the idea that musicians can be some kind of shaman, some kind of, telling us something. I read a really good interview with Nick Cave where he was talking about how songs write themselves for him sometimes, and that in his songs are telling him the future, and he's not getting, he can't quite explain that. And I think Walter Benjamin was very good at saying that about the kind of magic that is contained in art, that there is a relationship between those things. So that is there's a lot of stuff going on in those arguments. I would say that the world of musicians is often filled with just people. My experience of having spent 30 years working with musicians and being surrounded by musicians, relatively speaking, I would say that most of them are quite emotionally fragile. Or they're certainly in tune to emotion in a way. I think it is emotional work, so I think they are in tune with emotion. Yeah, I haven't spent 30 years around bankers, so I have no knowledge of what bankers think. I'm trying to think of I teach in a university, so academics think a lot. So I'm around people that think a lot, which isn't the same as people that are emotionally in tuned, because I think those things are different, and I think they unfold in different ways.
Apparently, your book was not only met with enthusiastic reception. You were also accused of painting too negative a picture of music industry, weren't you?
Yes, by some, but interestingly, they've all overcome that. And I've done talks about my work and the research in every major record label now, in most places, and also I even talk to people that work in the health service, and because really, one of the things about music and musical work is that there's this idea that it foreshadows shapes of capitalism, it foreshadows economic development, and I think that a lot of that's very true, and that the work of Jacques Attali is work that I relied on to do the research in the first instance. So I think there's sort of very interesting parallels with that, and certainly with the information and knowledge age. So working in hyper competition, in environments of hyper competition, and understanding the value of information within that and how it circulates, and changing models of work, which the pandemic really brought to the forefront. But for many musicians, they'd already been working in this way. So I think that there's a lot to be learned for the rest of society by looking at what we call the gig economy, right? So I think that, yes, we got some hate from the haters, but it's okay, they love us now.
Where did the critical voices come from? Like record labels mostly, or?
Okay, yeah, I can't say because I'm not allowed to decide. Yeah, they came from the very powerful sources. Yeah, but it's okay because we are friends now. Because then they asked me to come back and talk about gender equality, and I said you wouldn't like it. Well, I have to say you won't like.
Aside from the diagnosis, do you offer solutions? I mean, both for the system and for the musicians themselves. I mean, let's start from the musicians. What would be like your advices for musicians to keep,
Well, I think I think talking about it is part of the solution. I think people understanding how much of your emotional self and your psychological distress comes from your working environment. So I think that is one solution, and I think that we can change normative behavior. We have, as humans, we have changed a lot of our behavior over time. We used to live in huts, right? It's like people say, oh, it's always been like this. And I'm like, it has not always been like this. Like, my father died, he'd never seen a mobile phone, right? If he came here now, my father was from Poland. If he came here now, he'd have, what are you doing in Poland would be the first thing he'd say to me, right? But you can't say, we change, everything can change, and talking about the impact of this work and talking about the value of music for society and talking about inclusivity, talking about the ramifications of inequality on our psyche, very useful work, useful conversations that need to be had, yeah.
And how about some systematic solutions? Because the research was done with coordination with Help Musicians UK.
Yes, it was
organization.
fun.
I figured out it is like 100 years old, the charity. So it's not a new topic actually.
No, it was. It used to be called the Musicians Benevolent Society, and it was always there to support musicians. And so they funded the research. They've set up a helpline. They're offering psychological support, business support. So that whole area has really, amazingly expanded. And all the major record labels have mental health first aiders. They all have mental health and well-being programs. The Music Managers Forum has mental health and well-being programs. Live music. I mean, that conversation has really, really changed. So now it's the time to see what will happen through that, and that's an ongoing work. But I'm really pleased and surprised about how much change has taken place and how many people are engaged in this work now. So.
You know the numbers? I mean, how many musicians, for example, are beneficiaries of these programs you're talking about?
I haven't got the figures on me, but there are so many that have applied that Help Musicians are now so their charity is called Music Minds. Well, their helpline was called Music Minds Matter, and now Music Minds Matter is going to become a charity in its own right. So they're going to set up a charity in its own right, which is huge. It's like a really big thing. So, but I don't know what's going on in Poland, but in the UK, every area, from PRS to MMF to the BFI, everybody has a mental health awareness scheme somewhere within their companies. So for me, it was a difficult conversation worth starting.
Yeah, definitely. And you've recommended as a part of the report was built in the music industry mental health task force. Has it happened? And
yeah, I mean, now there's, as is the way in the music industry, because it's so hyper competitive, it has a way of fragmenting, and everybody's doing, there's lots of different task force or different groups. So the live mental health in live music industry, mental health in DJs, everyone's got their own thing, and that's fine. Because it is complicated. People have different things. So as to one umbrella, no, there's no one umbrella, but everybody's talking. Everyone's got a thing, an area, and there's lots of groups. There's lots of groups now, and also I think very importantly, there's also areas that are engaging with men and are specifically looking in getting men to come in, because it was very clear immediately that there was a kind of gendering of mental health, like women would turn up to all the
men
talks.
don't ask for help until it's too late, or
they don't ask for help. They don't turn up to, when I started giving talks, it was always to women. So I was like, oh, there's no men in here. There's 80% of the music workforce is male, and not one of them is coming to my talks. What's going on? So yeah. Men have an issue talking, but yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Do you have any questions from the audience? Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Thanks for that. It's really important research and positive to hear about the changes coming out of it. I was just thinking about the education aspect and wondered if it's something that in your teaching, is it part of something that is sort of more formally discussed in sort of academic education?
Well, it certainly is on the course, up until now. Recently I've become a reader at university, which is something that people outside of academia don't know. It's sort of like one below professor. So I'm now officially a researcher, mainly in my work. And certainly on my course, I ran an MA in Music Business Management for the last 17 years at the University of Westminster. And certainly it's been very much part of our teaching, and we will be having a whole module, but also lots of colleges now have modules in mental health and well-being in the music industry, or mental health and working conditions, and that's spread. That's been something that I didn't expect to happen, but I've been very pleased to see how our work is being used across different institutions. We spoke at NYU in New York and in LA, and so around the world people are using the research to develop new models of education. And again, it's really, really important. But I think, when I started teaching in music business, what was very interesting was, and later on I became an external examiner, and I've been external examiner around the world in different countries, and there's never a module about the working conditions. It's like, oh, just ignore those. and that I found very interesting, because for me, this is always about working conditions, and it's about, it's almost about a silencing of working conditions if you don't make space to talk about them and educate what's going on, So you never don't go to school and get a lesson on housewifery, which you did do at one point, or you got domestic science in England, but actually the huge amounts of work that parenting and caring has, and it falls on women to do, is silenced by being not made visible. So for me, making visible the working conditions of the music industry was a primary concern. And I was able to do that partly because I also worked in France, where the working conditions for musicians are different and they're differently understood. So because I could do that, I was able to talk about that in my work and in my teaching. And it's very, very important, particularly, it's always been very important, but now post-pandemic, where work and how work is constituted is, you know, and I do think we have I think the music world has a lot to teach the rest of the world about these kinds of work, where it can be very enriching to do this work, but also very stressful. How do we get the enriching bits and remove some of the stress, but to make it a more progressive environment, and how can that help in a social setting? Yeah, so I think there's, you know, I think there's lots to be learned here in this area. Yeah.
This is so good. It's so good. There's so much there. So there were two things that you said that when I put them together, it opens up so many questions, which is that when you surveyed musicians, that most of them said, or none of them said, that money was a motivation.
Yeah.
But they also said after X number of years or X number of tours that they weren't getting what they wanted. So is it that music, that money isn't the motivator, but that they still believe that they should be rewarded, or is there other emotional things that people are looking for?
It's totally paradoxical and contradictory, but it also is another place where you have to go in and ask the difficult questions, because when someone says that to you, you know, I used to say to musicians that wanted me to manage them, they do that speech, my music is everything to me and I love it, and I, you know, it's not about the money. And I was like, I have 4 children, it's about the money. I want 20% of your nothing will not feed my 4 children. And they'd be like, what is she saying? And I'm like, no, I care about your music. But like, you've got to bring that in, you know. Of course there is an economic reality to this, of course there is. How do we make that function? How do we get people to kind of sit with it better, like, and not be like it's one or the other, you know? Like, in some ways we could say, well, in hip hop maybe, you know, people in the indie rock scene will go, oh, hip hop, like, it's just about the money. And I'm like, shut up, you know, because it's a funny thing, you know, and it's a funny way in, again, these are they're habits, and they're the aesthetics that roll around the different genres, you know. And then, you know, like I have a thing about tote bags. I'm like, really, now I've had enough. Yeah, I'll have an NFT tote bag, thank you, because I have so many, right? And if you're an indie rocker, you're like, oh, I'm going to make a tote bag and a t-shirt and whatever, right? Okay, and like, if you're a rapper, I'm going to do a deal with Nike and have, you know, trainers. Like, actually, these are all the same things. And it's just bringing that reality into the mix. We're being able to open up those questions, because we have a very contradictory and paradoxical relationship with money as much as we do with music, you know, and we just need to discuss, you know, to discuss things. I think the irony of social media, the irony of the digital age is that so many conversations are going on, so much is out there, there's so many voices, there's so much. But actually, what the pandemic really threw up is that we need action out of that. We need some resolutions. We need some, you know, talking isn't the work. Talking is part of the work. And that's why I say to people, making a record is part of the work. It isn't the only thing you're doing. And if you just want to make a record, fine. You don't need a manager. You don't need any of those. They just make a record. Because making a record just one bit.
These parts.
Well, it could be really painful. I've seen musicians really suffer in their, you know, trying to make it work, decide where it's over, like this song's too long, this song's too short, whatever. But at the end of the day, if you only want to make a record, fine. But if you want that other stuff, then you're not just wanting to make a record. And it's being able to ask those questions and stay with them and sustain the work that needs to be done that's why we've had to become so politically active. I never ever thought I would see the UK government questioning streaming royalties, and I've seen something and I'm like, whoa. I mean, in there, I sit on the Ivers Trust, and so many things have happened in it has been a remarkable period of time for musicians and creative people. And so, great, but we have to keep doing the work, and that's what I'll do, and then I'll die. And that'll be fine. I'll be perfectly happy with that. I'm not leaving the world of music, but, I'm not getting another job.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for this conversation. Thank you.